That's that typo, man. Not a tournament, nothing tournament. That's funny. Uh, Hello, ladies and gentlemen, everyone around and in between. This is Debate Sensei NPDA edition, not NADA edition. Um, I am Jared Kubika Miller, a debate coach and professor of communications, and I have with me my resident expert, Gabe Greville, who is the 2022 NPTE champion and a graduate assistant at SDSU and debate coach. Thank you so much for being with us, Gabe.
Good to be here.
Excellent. So we are going to talk about how to approach your first tournament. And for this episode, there's a lot of different contexts that I'm hoping to wade through. So your first tournament ever, your first tournament, coming back second, third, or fourth year, first tournament as a judge, first tournament as a coach. Those are a bunch of different ways that people can experience the first tournament. But let's start with if you are a student and you've just been recruited onto the team. We'll start with like zero context, right? Like how to prepare first, and then we'll get into what to expect. So let's say that you're in that context, Gabe, that you are coaching a student that has never been to a tournament before, and this is day one of prepping for the first tournament. Where do you start?
Well, assuming they know what NPDA is, we would typically start just by broadly, we start with what the different types of arguments are, what to expect. We try to have them do at least one practice round before, just so that they have flexed the muscles of speaking for 7 and 8 minutes and doing the thing. We can only lecture at them so much.
Right.
But really what we tell our first time competing students is to try to familiarize yourself with current events. Mm-hmm. Try to just get in the habit of reading the news, or at the very least reading headlines, so that if there's something that comes up in round in prep time, you can at least recall that there might be something relevant going on and do the research then. And then we try to manage their expectations in a healthy way. This isn't to say you're going to lose, but they are going to lose. It happens to everybody. Everybody who's ever been anything at NPDA did poorly their first tournament because they never did it before. It's completely different. You're going against people who've been doing it for years more than you have. I think also one thing that's nice about the limited prep format is that we also tell our students that they're in good hands. We get hired to coach and to prep at tournaments, right? Because we know how to coach and prep at tournaments. We've been on the competing side of it for enough time to know what that's like, and we've been coaching it enough to know that we can send our debaters into a round after 25 minutes with something to say and something that they could potentially win on.
Right. So let's start with the practice rounds, and then we'll get into the you also mentioned sort of like researching and filing and stuff like that. So the practice round seems pretty important, that you're not just practicing the debate, but the prep time as well, like being able to absorb that much information in a short amount of time. How do you manage that as a coach, especially for people that don't have a whole lot of experience with that?
Well, we standardize the way that we do prep time on our team. I think most places do this as well. This makes it seem more uniform and easy to understand when we're giving information. The way that I learned, or the way the prep rooms were run when I started, it was usually a couple coaches and then one coach just talking directly to a debater, telling them what words to write down, what to prep, dictating it, especially in the online era. we've mostly, I think most teams have moved to like a Google Doc or some sort of like
Right.
place where you can type it out and then your students can transcribe it themselves.
Wow. Yeah,
But
we used to use just the whiteboard. We always had to have just a whiteboard. Is that even if you have a whiteboard, or is everyone just moving to Google Docs?
I think I got a couple dis ads on a whiteboard when I competed, but
Oh man,
it's not. You can't write as fast as you can type, so
right.
we've been pretty much all Google Docs.
Okay. Yeah, I mean the technology changes are kind of wild. I'm a very big proponent of it, but I've been out of practice as far as coaching for a while. I've been kind of moving more towards the teaching and administration, and so it's nice to hear the way that things are changing and adapting, and seeing how it's always evolving. All right, so students they have their prep time. That's its own beast right there. How do you and that usually only gets them through the first couple of speeches, though. How do you get somebody through the second constructives and the rebuttals for their first
I think it's just repetition.
Okay.
There's specific drills that we do for specific speeches. We do redos if we do a practice round and one speech was a little rough around the edges, we'll have a student just do that specific speech. Sometimes we'll make them give the speech again, but maybe do a different collapse or read a different argument or whatever. And we can address those later speeches there. But you're absolutely right. The way that we dominantly coach and view Parley is that we give them everything in the first two speeches, and then we just hope that they can carry on that information through the rest of the round. I think it's something that needs to be addressed more broadly in coaching. I think that we can get students more proficient, better at debate faster, the faster we're able to get them to understand how to give the last four speeches in a round.
And so we're doing these drills, but let's move on to somebody's coming back in for their second or third year. Okay, the first year you're like, get at least one. What do you think the standard should be for somebody returning? Like they're coming up on their first, like how far out should they start prepping? When should they call their summer vacation over and the season begun?
When I was competing, every time we ended our season and we went into the summer, we always told ourselves we'd be working all summer, and then we typically did not. I think I wrote maybe 4 files during the summer in my whole career. Should I have been working over the summer? Probably. Do other schools and do people who actually care about this stuff work over the summer? Definitely. But I think that it's not necessarily everybody does it. I would say because it's an academic activity tied to your school, you should be working on debate at minimum, like once the school year starts. This year works out nice for us. We don't have a tournament until the middle of October, and we've been in class since the end of August. So we have almost 2 months of time to directly work with our students. But I know my first tournament was during the move-in convocation at University of Oregon. Okay. And we didn't have any time prior to that. So, yeah.
So let's talk about how to prepare a knowledge base for it. So students that are going in and going to compete, because this is a different topic every single round, what type of materials do you prepare? How do you anticipate what to say and what to have easy reference during prep time?
So we always did uniqueness updates for what we considered the big 3 advantage disad generics. That was politics, econ, and hedge. Okay. So we would always, at the beginning of the year, update our arguments for that, where we have the internal link and impact scenario. We'd figure out what was the most, I guess, the best argument we thought in that season. If it wasn't a politics year, then we wouldn't read politics. If we, prior to the invasion of Ukraine, maybe we were reading Russia scenarios. Afterwards, maybe we're reading Taiwan scenarios. But we would update it based on what we thought was most competitive. And then as close to the tournament as possible, we would do research and find warrants for our uniqueness in both directions.
Okay.
We always did this as competitors. This was always assigned to us. Our coaches didn't do this. And this is something that I think is extremely important, because the more your students have written and know themselves, the faster prep is going to be for them no matter what. And when they get into round and they get out of that first speech and they're having to answer an argument that directly contests their uniqueness, they're more likely to know and explain the warrants that we've given them or that they've given themselves if they know it because they researched it. So we always have that sort of initial research for those three general topic areas. And then, like I said prior, we want to have a general awareness of current events so that they can know of things that might relate to the topic and come up with things in rounds and in prep that would be beneficial to them.
It usually, like, the way that we kept up with current events is that we would do extemporaneous speaking as an event. And if those who are watching that don't know, it is basically a current event topic. You get 30 minutes to prepare a 7-minute speech, and it's always on some sort of current event, something that might have happened within the previous 2 weeks. Is that expectation still around for debaters?
No, I think it's not. I think it's largely because a lot of the NPDA big tournaments do not offer any sort of extemp.
Right.
It's difficult to have students compete in both speech and debate in a large team where coaching is sort of limited between the students anyway. It's not something we expect. And I also think that while extemp does get you very knowledgeable about current events, and it is a very similar skill to Parley, I think that a more shallow but extremely broad understanding of current events is almost more beneficial for Parley, because we can still do that research in prep time and just skim articles as efficiently as we can.
So you said there's a lot of uniqueness in following current events. Do you prep out just full ass cases? We used to just brief them out. It's like, all right, here's our 1AC on Russia, Ukraine. This is our 1AC on that. We just basically be shooting blind, right? Just thinking, well, maybe we'll hit something. Is that still kind of a strategy?
Partially, I would say that's not a common strategy anymore. People are a little bit more pointed with what they prep, but that is very similar to a strategy that me and my partner, when we competed, tried to employ. We tried to just write as many disad scenarios as possible. Okay. Because with disad scenarios, you just need to change the direction of the links and the uniqueness in order to make it like an advantage. So that by the time we were in rounds, we would have sort of like loose pieces of arguments that we had written throughout the year, throughout the summer, that we could very quickly reassemble into 1AC or an LOC.
Okay. And I'm interested to know how note-taking has changed. So flowing was always just pen and paper, and I would have a bunch of different answer twos on different Post-it cards, and I would be able to just kind of transfer them really quick onto the flow sheet. What's that looking like these days? Flowing.
So when I competed, it was still all on pen and paper. Prep time was essentially writing as much as possible in that amount of time. When you get proficient enough at prepping, you usually find yourself with extra time, and that's where you start writing extra arguments, maybe add-ons in the MG that you can continue to have here if you think it's going to come down to some sort of structural violence neg case against your big stick impact AF case. Maybe you start writing impact calculus, but you just kind of keep writing on pieces of paper. I would say pretty much every round we would go in with maybe 10 pieces of paper, and we'd read maybe 4 or 5 of them, just because we wanted to have as many options as possible. With the advent of flowing on computers, this has definitely changed, and I'm not fully aware of how all the other teams are doing it. Our team at SDSU, we type the constructed speeches that we prep our students on a computer, and then everything after that is done on paper. So when we're dictating, when we're giving them the arguments, they're typing it on their computers. They read off their computers for the first 2 speeches, and then the rest is done on pen and paper. We didn't have Post-it notes. We don't have Post-it notes. But it's a lot of, we try to standardize how to flow as coaches, because it makes it easier for people who have no idea how to flow to do it in the best way. But everybody sort of learns how to flow with their partner in a different way, and you sort of create your own shorthand. You create different ways of organizing information, different ways that you organize your speeches based on the pieces of paper you have in front of you, and that's something that I think there isn't a single best practice. It's up to how you and your partner best communicate during a round.
All right. Now, partner communication is an important part of prepping as well. How do you prepare students to be as efficient as possible? What do you suggest?
We just had a discussion at practice about this with our students, because I don't know if this was really a thing when you were competing, but it's very common to sort of flag your partner while they're talking, and to remind them to make an argument or to not make an argument. It's can be really janky, really clunky in the when you first start doing it, but you eventually sort of learn when your partner naturally pauses, how they organize their speeches, when to interject without breaking their stream of thought. As far as partner communication outside of the round like that, though, I think it's important between partners to have not necessarily the same expectations for themselves and their performance, but congruent expectations that don't clash with one another. If one partner, for example, if one partner really wants to try to be nationally competitive and win it all, and then another partner is not willing to put in that time, that's not necessarily a conducive partner synergy. But if one partner really has the desire to compete at that high level, and the other partner maybe doesn't have that same level of desire but is willing to continue to put in the work, then there is still synergy that we can work with. And I think that where a lot of communication between partners breaks down is how partners react to losses. I think it's extremely difficult to teach. The best teacher is experiencing those losses, and it's something as a coach that you can sort of only deal with and mitigate as it arises and try to prepare them for it prior. But there's no true preparation if you don't know how someone's going to react to a particularly bad loss.
Yeah, that was we mentioned the NPTE website on the last episode, and it kind of comes back to that. I used to teach that lesson to new students by showing them my win-loss percentage on the website, and point out the best debaters have 70%, right? The best, if you're going long enough. And so you're pretty good if you got 60%. And so that kind of helps, right? The whole baseball metaphor where if you're batting 300, you're doing great type of thing. For debate, it's a little bit higher. You still have to be above 50, but yeah, it's so sad that what the state of that website is right now. I hope that gets resolved.
Me too.
Let's switch now. So we talked all about being competitors, how you prepare and stuff like that. You have just transitioned to, like your eligibility's done. You're now a judge and coach for as long as you want to be from here on out. What are some things that I don't know, some revelations that might have happened as a judge or exclusively as a judge? Because I'm sure you've judged rounds before the last couple of years. But are you learning anything new now that you are not going to compete anymore?
The main thing that I learned when judging, I do really like judging. I especially like giving feedback, and when people seem to want feedback, I think it's very rewarding. And I remember it being rewarding when I was a competitor, and there was a judge that I really respected their opinion, and they were willing to take a little extra time to explain things to me. The main difference that I've identified is that when you're a competitor and you're flowing the round, you don't actually flow the round objectively per se. You flow the round from the perspective of your arguments, and you flow their arguments under the guise that you're going to answer those arguments. So when I would debate and I would flow an MG and I would think about our collapse in the block, I was very quick to maybe write off certain arguments because I felt that this was not, like, if they do end up going for this argument, we're absolutely going to win because this is a terrible argument.
Right.
Or we've already, like, they haven't answered anything that we've said on this argument. We're so far ahead on this. There's no way they go for this. I'm thinking much more about this other argument that we didn't answer as well. And that's not really how you can't judge like that because you're not in the round. And sometimes people do go for those arguments that maybe you think there's no way they should have gone for this argument. Mm-hmm. And being able to, like, take a step back and, like, look at the flow as objectively as possible is definitely sort of a new skill. The perspective you have as a competitor is as optimistic of your own arguments as possible, and it's as pessimistic of their arguments as well.
Right.
As a judge, you have to be as, like, fair and balanced. Like, if you're going for it on something that you didn't think that you were going to have to go for this argument when you prepped it, you're going to, in your mind, start preparing yourself to think of it as a winning argument because you're about to say it's a winning argument for the next 12 minutes.
Do you have any different perspective on a seasoned judge and more of a novice judge? Do you see any sort of identifiable differences in maturity that happens through that process?
Yeah, I think it's kind of it's a funny stereotype that a first year out judge will give. They'll take like 40 minutes to come up with their decision, and then they'll take 40 minutes to explain it. Certainly, that's not the rule. There were great judges that would take a while, and there were, terrible judges that would go very quickly. But a lot of the people who've been around for quite a while, they're very concise with their RFDs. They're very concise when they are evaluating the rounds, and they're a lot more predictable because of it. It might not be obvious how they're predictable, but if you watch them judge enough, you start to figure it out.
Got it. So we talked about first tournaments as competitor, a little bit shorter first tournaments as judges, but now let's talk a little bit about first tournaments for coaches. And I think one of the questions I like asking other coaches are, do you have any sort of skills building exercises that might be a little outside the norm, or at least not just practice rounds? Of course, everyone does practice rounds, right? You've mentioned, redos and things like that, but are there any other exercises that you might suggest to prepare for the first tournament?
For a coach, I think that the skill in itself is very similar to when you're a competitor, especially when you are a very experienced competitor. Coaching good teams and prepping them is much less giving them every argument. They usually find the arguments they want to say themselves. It's helping guide them to those arguments and then giving them arguments that they might not have thought of because they're doing the brunt of the work. I don't know if it's like that for every school, but that's certainly how it was when I was a competitor. Our senior year, our prep coaches absolutely were amazing, and they gave us tons of arguments, but it was more so, okay, we want to do this. Alex, you write this. I'll write this. In the meantime, can we tell our coach, can you get me this specific argument? Or here's something I don't know how to prep. Can you type that out for me so I can look at it? And it's more using your prep coaches as a tool in themselves more than them kind of molding you into the round. But that's only at the sort of higher levels. But I think that as a competitor, that means that you're used to prepping yourself. You're used to being able to do the whole debate thing without a prep coach, less efficiently and less proficiently. But you already know how to write a PMC and an LOC. You already know what you think you're going to expect. Now you just have to translate it to giving it to your students. But the main difference I've found is explaining myself, I think. I can, if I'm just writing an AF for myself, I obviously know what the AF means. But sometimes your students don't have any sort of context on the topic itself or on this argument base or this type of dissad that you're writing them anyway. So being able to remember those LOR overview skills and say, the argument just says this, right? They're probably going to say this to it. This is your answer.
Right.
Try to remember that. And it's kind of, you kind of just give them as much information as possible and just hope that they remember it. But that's the main difference, I think.
And so speaking of differences, the prep time, you were kind of touching upon it about how as a competitor, your role is defined, your PM or MG, your LO, MO. As a coach during prep time, your role isn't defined. Do you find yourself falling into certain roles? Specifically, if there are multiple coaches in the prep room, how do you divide that labor? Is there a standard way of doing it, or do you find yourself switching it up every round?
There's no standard way of doing it. It's where people's strengths and weaknesses lie, for sure. When we were freshmen, we were coached by Sean McKean, who had been on the team for forever, and he knew every single file in the Dropbox. He had a ridiculous memory when it came to rounds, and the Dropbox was a complete mess. But he was so good at knowing exactly where files from rounds that related to the current round were. And that was a large part of what he did. In our prep room, we learned this last year at Nationals. I've never been a very good econ debater or prep coach, but my director of debate, Kyle, is a fantastic econ prep coach, and he actually knows what all those indicators mean. So immediately there's like a natural division of labor there.
Right.
Similarly, the old coaches were more inclined to some of the more critical arguments that were being read. I was coming in later in the season, so I was sort of put onto the newer debaters just because I had less experience with the team that ended up going pretty far.
Right.
And I think that there's like the small natural divisions of labor that arise just based on people's skills. But there isn't like a hard and fast way to do it because you never know who's better at different things.
Excellent. Well, I think that is a pretty good overview on the many different ways in which to prepare for the very first tournament. I want to thank you, Gabe, for helping us out, giving your perspective on these things. Okay. So we are going to be back for another debate-related topic, specifically for NPDA in the future. I'll see you then, everyone.